Friends, I want to welcome you to our webinar this evening. Thank you for coming, and thank you for joining us today to discuss the religious dimensions of the war against Ukraine. My name is John Martins, and I direct the Center for Christian Engagement at St. Mark's College. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the land on which St. Mark's College sits, the college which is sponsoring this event, is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We at the college are thankful for our ability to live, work, and pray on this territory. And I want to welcome our distinguished panel, Dr. Heather Coleman, Dr. Nicholas Denisenko, Dr. Paul Gavrilyuk, and Miroslav Tatarin, a priest of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, who will help us to understand the religious dimensions of the current war against Ukraine and some of the deep religious roots of this conflict. I'm so thankful that our panelists can be with us tonight and that they agreed to participate on such short notice. It is really generous of them. They are so busy, all of them, in responding at personal, parish, academic, and humanitarian levels to this war. I am, however, sorry that such a distinguished panel must be put together in these conditions and in the present circumstances of this war. Yet understanding what is going on in Russia and Ukraine is essential to responding to the current war. The truth is always necessary, and amidst the lies and propaganda of wartime, a necessary antidote. Truthful understanding is an important part of civil and democratic society. And I know there are many other things you can do to help support people during this time, but this is one of them. There are also a number of other learned panels and lectures on the Ukraine war that you can find dealing with politics, economics, military aspects of this war, and they're all deeply important. And I encourage you to seek out the experts in your region, your city, your local universities. But the religious dimensions of this war against Ukraine haven't been covered to the same degree. And the religious aspects of this war are deep and ancient. And the people capable of covering this topic are far fewer than those compared to the economic, political, and military aspects. I'm thankful that our four panelists have been willing to share their expertise and time with us today. And before I introduce them, and I'll do that before each of them speaks, I want to explain our format. Each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, and following all four speakers, they'll be given some time to speak with each other, but following that, we'll have time for Q&A. So please be prepared to put your questions in the Q&A function. I'll monitor the questions and ask as many as possible in the time we have. Now, I would like just to take a moment of silence to begin to remember the victims of this war, those who have lost their lives and those suffering in so many ways today, those still being attacked, those without food, and the millions who are now refugees. I pray that God opens hearts and moves our thoughts to the ways of peace. Awaken in us a compassion for the victims of war. Fill us with sorrow over the suffering caused by war. Pray for the grieving fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters, every person in Ukraine, and those suffering in Russia too. Pray for conversion of our own hearts that will guide us in the way of peace, and pray for an end to war in Ukraine. Our first panelist is Heather Coleman. Heather Coleman is professor of Russian history and director of the research program on religion and culture at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta. Dr. Coleman is the author of numerous books, including Russian Baptists and Spiritual Revolution, 1905 to 1929, and editor of Sacred Stories, Religion and Spirituality in Modern Russia, and Orthodox Christianity in Imperial Russia, a source book on lived religion. Those are all published by Indiana University Press. Her current research focuses on the history of the Orthodox clergy in 19th century Kiev province. And she's going to outline the basic framework of religion in Ukraine and the Russian-Ukrainian religious past and their relations. So please welcome Dr. Heather Coleman.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks to everyone who's come out this evening. I'm the deep and ancient section of the evening's events that John mentioned, and I'd like to take a few moments to outline a little bit the religious landscape in Ukraine, and then to talk about the history of Russian-Ukrainian religious relations, because they are critical to this conflict. Ukraine has quite a complex religious landscape. About 65% of Ukrainians identify as Orthodox, making Orthodox Christianity by far the biggest faith in Ukraine. But there are also a further 10% who are Catholics, and there are substantial Baptist and Pentecostal communities, as well as Jews and Muslims with deep historical roots in the country. And the way that these various groups of believers are organized is very important for understanding the significance of religion in the current conflict. Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, is a profoundly symbolic site in the whole Orthodox world, and especially for the Eastern Slavs, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, and the Russians, who all trace their Christianization and their origins to Grand Prince Volodymyr of Kyiv's decision over 1,000 years ago to accept Christianity from the Greeks and then to baptize his people. These common origins are a potential source of kinship, but also of tension in the modern world. For example, the Russian Orthodox Church has long asserted that Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine make up its exclusive canonical territory, its religious field where other churches cannot legitimately enter. In Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church is the largest religious institution with the most members. Historically, and again in recent years, it has asserted a special relationship with the Russian nation and with the Russian state. But in Ukraine, the story is more complex, much more complex. In Ukraine, there are several different churches that all claim the mantle of being the national church of the Ukrainian people, that all trace their roots to Kyiv. There are several distinct Orthodox churches, for example. Orthodox Christianity is a family of self-governing churches, and the various Orthodox churches position themselves differently within this family in Ukraine. The most important are, first, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is a self-governing or autocephalous church that is in communion with the Patriarchate of Constantinople. The other major Orthodox church is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is a local church of the Moscow Patriarchate. So the Moscow family within the self-governing families of churches. But very significantly, there is also a large Catholic population in Ukraine, and it too considers itself to be an inheritor of the Kyiv tradition. In fact, since the late 16th century, ethnic Ukrainians have been divided religiously between Orthodoxy, which is dominant in the central and eastern parts of the country, and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which predominates in the western region. The Greek Catholic Church is an Eastern Rite church. That means that it worships with an Orthodox style liturgy, but it is in union with the Roman Catholic Church, and it recognizes the Pope as the head of the church. Because Ukrainians are both divided in their religious affiliation and quite religiously active, pluralism has been the order of the day in Ukraine, in Ukrainian state life since independence in 1991. In fact, Ukraine has a unique organization that reflects this pluralism. It's an interdenominational Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. And for over 25 years, it has brought together Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and Muslim organizations to promote dialogue between religious confessions and to advise the state on religious affairs, church-state relations. And the existence and activism of that council really reflects the broader pluralism and the high level of civic activism that characterizes Ukrainian public life. As the crisis has unfolded these past few weeks, the international relationships of the Ukrainian churches have played out in interesting ways, and we'll hear more about that from my colleagues. But I just want to say a few words about the very complicated history of Russian-Ukrainian religious relations. And I look at the time and it's a very complicated story, so I'll do my best. Although Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus share common origins in Kiev, their histories are intertwined, but they are separate. And indeed, there's a period of about 400 years from the 13th to the 17th century, when the northern and southern Rus territories took separate paths. The southwest and the southeast, what is now Belarus and western and central Ukraine, were absorbed by Poland and Lithuania. The principalities to the north were gradually united under the Principality of Moscow. And in this period, church life began to separate. By the mid-15th century, the Muscovite Church had in practice become autocephalous or self-governing. It consecrated its own bishops without involving the Patriarch of Constantinople as they had earlier. Whereas in the south and the west, a separate metropolitanate of Kiev with jurisdiction over all of the Rus people living in Poland, Lithuania, remained under Constantinople. Later in the 17th century, the mid-17th century, the eastern part of Ukraine, the eastern part of Belarus, and the city of Kiev came under Russian control. And when this happened, the question of the position of the Ukrainian church in the Orthodox world arose. And there was a lengthy period of negotiations, following which in 1686, the Metropolitan of Kiev placed his church, which had been under the Patriarch of Constantinople, he placed his church under the Patriarch of Moscow. And this is the moment when the fate of Ukrainian and Russian Orthodoxy become intertwined and have remained so ever since. The Ukrainian church then became part of the Russian Orthodox Church in the late 17th century. But in the early years, the Ukrainians played a really critical role in the culture of that church. The Ukrainians in the 17th century, living under Polish rule, Polish Catholic rule, Polish counter-Reformation rule, had to essentially fight fire with fire. They had founded an academy in Kiev on the Jesuit model in order to train educated Orthodox scholars and clerics to revive Orthodoxy and strengthen it. And those skills were much needed by the Russian church, and the Orthodox Ukrainian churchmen played a very critical role in the early imperial Russian church. Nevertheless, the Ukrainian church was completely integrated into the Russian Orthodox Church, and as Ukrainian autonomy in the Russian Empire was curtailed. Now, during the 18th and especially the 19th and early 20th century, Ukrainians were regarded by the Russian state as Russians, and they were, as I say, integrated into the church. Within the church, you developed Ukrainophile and Russophile sort of wings of the church. And these came into full view at the time of the Revolution of 1917, when the All-Ukrainian Church Council of January 1918 sought autonomy within the Russian Orthodox Church. Later, by 1921, you have the establishment of a Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church in this period of nationalism and revolution. However, that Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church remained unrecognized by other Orthodox churches. During the Second World War, all churches were pretty much closed down in the 1930s, but during the Second World War, the church was able to revive again, in the Russian Empire. However, it was exclusively the Russian Orthodox Church, and it was in fact used by the government to integrate religiously the Western Ukrainian territories that were brought into the Soviet Union after the Second World War, territories where the population were Greek Catholics, and they were forcibly brought into the Orthodox Church. This fell apart, however, during the Gorbachev period and in the last years of the Soviet Union. When Gorbachev, who had hoped to enlist the population in his reform program by reaching out to the churches and allowing freer religious life, this completely backfired when Catholicism became a vehicle for expressing repressed nationalist identities in Western Ukraine. When the Greek Catholics and also the Ukrainian autocephalists reemerged and began to seize parishes within the Ukrainian Republic. And so at the time of the, I'm out of my time, but at the end of at the beginning of the post-Soviet period, you have the emergence of new churches in the Ukrainian space. You have in recognition of the desire for autonomy, the Moscow Patriarchate created the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, a semi-autonomous church. But you also have the emergence of two competing autocephalous churches. And that was the basic situation right up until 2018, when following the Euromaidan protests, the seizure of Crimea, and the beginning of war in the Donbass region, Ukrainian Orthodoxy began to be renewed concerns about the legitimacy of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. And the Patriarch of Constantinople called a special conference, or a church council, pardon me, in 2018 of the three Ukrainian Orthodox churches with the hope of creating an autocephalous Ukrainian Orthodox Church. A church was created, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and it was granted autocephaly or recognized as autocephalous by the Patriarch of Constantinople, although most of the bishops by far of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate did not participate. And so when this church was founded, the Moscow Patriarchate broke relations with Constantinople. And so there's a schism that has emerged in the Orthodox world. I'll just say one or two more minutes. The final thing to say is that the Patriarch of the Moscow Patriarch Kirill Gundayev has been very active in asserting what is known as the Russian world doctrine, the notion that the Ukrainians and Belarusians and Russians are one people, that this is one Russian land united by orthodoxy. And from the time of, even before the seizure of Crimea, he had made it his business to visit Ukraine regularly, to talk about common roots, to visit Kiev, to visit Crimea, and to assert this common past. And this has been a major theme of his response to the invasion in the last few weeks. I've gone over my time, so I'll stop there, but I'm happy to answer more questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. That's hardly enough time for the complexity of what you're dealing with. So I thank you for covering it in that short time. And there will be time for questions. We will take our questions at the end. Hopefully people are taking notes, and there is much to discuss. And I really appreciate giving us that background. And when I talked about complexity, you could certainly see it on display there in Dr. Coleman's comments. We're next going to have Nicholas Denisenko speak. Nicholas Denisenko serves as the Emil and Elfrida Jochum Professor and Chair at Valparaiso University in Indiana, where he is the Associate Professor of Theology. He received his graduate degrees from St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary and the Catholic University of America. Dr. Denisenko writes and speaks on liturgical theology and Orthodox Christianity. He has written widely, including The People's Faith, The Liturgy of the Faithful and Orthodoxy, published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2018, and his book, The Orthodox Church in Ukraine, A Century of Separation, which was published by Northern Illinois University Press in 2018. Denisenko is also an ordained deacon of the Orthodox Church. He's going to discuss the difficult dynamics of church and politics in the Ukrainian church under Moscow in particular, with some reference to the theological themes that give us hints on their positions. And I do believe Dr. Coleman sort of was discussing some of those issues right at the end of her talk. So welcome, Dr. Denisenko.
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Martins, for the invitation to present this evening. Some of what I'm going to say will refer back to the excellent introduction by Dr. Coleman. There are two large Orthodox communities in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Both claim to be and have legitimacy within their claims to be heirs of the 10th century Kievan Church. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Moscow has over 50 eparchial bishops and 12,000 parishes. Unlike the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is autocephalous or completely sovereign, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Moscow is autonomous in governance. And this was on the basis of a change to its statute that was made in 1990, and the timing is key. It occurred right during that period of thaw of the legalization of the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church and the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church in the last years of Gorbachev. In 1990, on the eve of the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have the Ukrainian Exarchate suddenly having a new statute that claims autonomy, even if it's not officially autonomy. An example of this is that the leader of this church under Moscow, the Metropolitan of Kiev, became a permanent member of the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church and participates in all of its meetings. So if we fast forward 1 year to November 1991, on two occasions, the entire episcopate of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Moscow petitioned the Russian Orthodox Church and requested complete autocephaly or sovereignty, a document that was signed by all of its bishops. In April 1992, the Russian Orthodox Church denied the petition, and then they tried to push the leader of the Ukrainian Church under Moscow, Metropolitan Filaret, into retirement. Filaret's strong hand in trying to push autocephaly upon his episcopate and upon his church, alienated many bishops and clergy of the Ukrainian church under Moscow who were simply not ready to make this move this quickly. And so that's sort of the background of the initial push that shows that in its early, late and post-Soviet stages, the Ukrainian church under Moscow indeed did request autocephaly. Now, if we look at the Ukrainian church under Moscow today, it's unique. And I think that its unicity gives us a hint of its internal identity. So one of the ways in which it is similar to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church is that the Ukrainian church under Moscow is strongest in West and Central Ukraine. However, and this is an interesting note for the contemporary situation, the Luhansk, Donetsk, and Simferopol eparchies remained within the Ukrainian church under Moscow even after the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass. So if we get a sense of the geographical breadth of the church, and we look at its entire post-Soviet history, the Ukrainian church under Moscow has, in this post-Soviet period, been very cautious about being too overtly pro-Ukrainian. A very good example of this is an internal document, or actually a series of documents. Some of the most important ones that were reflections upon the identity of the church came out in 2012, on the 20th anniversary of the so-called Kharkiv Council, when the bishops of the church elected Metropolitan Volodymyr as the successor to Metropolitan Filaret. In this document, the author, attributed to Metropolitan Volodymyr, emphasized that the church embraces all of Ukraine, both East and West, and therefore has to find a way to unify the entire church. And certainly it's for this reason that the Ukrainian church under Moscow never really pursued Ukrainization, meaning adopting modern Ukrainian for the celebration of the liturgy like other churches did. They only went as far as to publish a gospel book that was a Ukrainian translation, and occasionally allowed priests and bishops to preach in Ukrainian. In fact, the current Metropolitan Onufri in 2015 stirred some controversy when he made comments at the December meeting of the clergy of the Kievan Eparchy, where he was extremely critical of the adoption of modern Ukrainian, essentially saying it was inferior to the church Slavonic language that most of the churches of the Slavic tradition use for worship. One other area in which the church under Moscow has been different from its siblings in Ukraine is that it stopped pursuing autocephaly. So in 1992, at this Kharkiv Council, in the documents, the Ukrainian church under Moscow said that they were on the path to canonical autocephaly and intended to achieve and arrive at that point. But that stopped in 1996. In fact, when pressed, and this happened quite frequently, especially since the Euromaidan Revolution of Dignity, Metropolitan Onufri has consistently claimed that the church under Moscow does not need autocephaly. He has defined autocephaly as creating a separation from the rest of the world's Orthodox churches and has said it is not necessary. And we will see shortly that the tone is changing somewhat. So within Ukraine, the church under Moscow, the lack of interest in Ukrainization and autocephaly gave the appearance of coziness with Russia. And this played out in the political sphere as well. As early as 2004, during the Orange Revolution, the figures within the Ukrainian church under Moscow occasionally assumed a pro-Russian public posture. This occurred with multiple endorsements of the candidacy of Viktor Yanukovych as the only Orthodox candidate in 2004. And I appreciate Dr. Coleman's reference to the Russian world and Patriarch Kirill's promotion of it. The most ostentatious occasion of the promotion of the Russian world was in 2013, on the 1025th anniversary of the baptism of Rus, where there is a 3-city stational celebration in Moscow, Kyiv, and Minsk. In Kyiv, President Putin of the Russian Federation had an audience with the bishops of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Moscow and conferred awards on them. There is also the issue of the public and consistent anti-war position adopted by the Ukrainian Church under Moscow, and their steadfast refusal to name an aggressor in the war in Donbass for the last 8 years, an issue that has certainly become blown up in the media. And then finally, those of you who are familiar with the autocephaly issue know that former President Poroshenko was a lightning rod in the role that he exercised in autocephaly for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. The church under Moscow also has a political patron. This is Vadim Novinsky, who is a member of parliament, a native of St. Petersburg, a member of the opposition bloc, and a proto-deacon in the church. And I'm saying all of this because in 2018 and 19, there were SBU Secret Service investigations of select Ukrainian Orthodox communities as Russian fifth column cells. And it's fair to note that occasionally the public discourse on this church included what we might consider to be hate speech, with words and epithets used such as Moscow's priests, UOC, FSB, Church of the Occupiers. And this leads to an academic question. Is the whole church a Russian cell? There are a number of scholars who have addressed this issue, including Denis Shestopolitz and Victoria Hudson, who essentially say no because of the church's size, although you can certainly identify certain figures who certainly adopt a pro-Russian perspective. And I agree with them. It's just too big of a church to make that argument. It violates the integrity of the size of the church and the diversity of people within it. But here's and I'll segue to the end here. These alliances today, in the course of this war, are proving to be terrible obstacles for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Moscow. And knowing I only have a few minutes left, I'll end with this. There are two things. The first is that the two theological themes that are coming out in the public discourse of the church under Moscow is first a call to repentance, which at least suggests the possibility that the things that are happening are caused by sin and require God's divine mercy. And the second one, which has received a great deal of attention, is Metropolitan Onufriy's comparison of what's happening now to the episode in the book of Genesis and the Cain killing Abel, although he doesn't say who Cain is. And it's important to note that this is a rather common refrain anytime a war breaks out in theological discourse, to say that this is an episode of Cain and Abel when neighboring countries battle like this. In 2014, the aforementioned Metropolitan Philaret sent an encyclical letter where he called President Putin Novi Cain, the new Cain, and named him as the aggressor. So there's a lot of recirculation of tropes and themes that's happening here. The last point that I want to make is that in a certain sense, we are not in completely new territory. I think there's a glimmer of hope. And the glimmer of hope is that in 1942, two Orthodox churches in Ukraine that were really at odds with one another and engaged in quite polemical battle signed an agreement, an act of union, where the fourth point of that act essentially stated, we are going to set all of our canonical differences aside for the sake of unity. And it's my opinion that the Ukrainian church under Moscow is essentially at that crossroads now. Will they be able to set aside their differences with the OCU for the sake of unity? And the same question should be posed to the OCU, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. I don't know the answer to this question, but what it seems to me is right now that the church is actually behind, and that the people, the Ukrainian people, are the ones who are showing the church what it means to be unified. So thank you for the time, and I look forward to more opportunity for discussion.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you for filling in some of those gaps, and also in drawing out those two theological themes and giving some context for them, and also the glimmer of hope at the end. And I hope we can come back to that in the questions. I think all of us are looking in this for some glimmers of hope, and this is really helpful. I want to introduce our third panelist, Miroslav Tatarin. He's Professor Emeritus of the Department of Religious Studies at St. Jerome's University and former chair of the Department of Religious Studies and director of the Center for Responsible Citizenship. He is also the priest, the pastor of Holy Transfiguration Parish in Kitchener, Ontario, since 2014, an Eastern Catholic community, Ukrainian. He holds the THD from St. Michael's College in Toronto. His research interests include Eastern Christian theology in the contemporary context, Eastern Christians in Canada, a number of other themes in his research, including the relationship between religious experience and culture, and the applicability of Eastern Christian thought to the contemporary Western context. He is married, he is a father of children with disabilities, and with his wife has authored Discovering Trinity in Disability, a theology for embracing difference. I welcome Miroslav Tatarin here to speak about the efforts of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in Caritas Ukraine, which also connects to the mobilization of the diaspora, the Ukrainian diaspora, and some other themes that he will now take on. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you to my co-panelists, and thank you to everyone who's out there interested and concerned about our topic. I suppose the way I'm approaching this is, coming from, I'll say, a minority church in Ukraine. I'd like to talk about how, mainly about how the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church is living its life within that complex pluralistic religious environment that is Ukraine of the past and certainly of the present. And I think I'll start just with a comment that I received from someone in Lviv, and it's a very meaningful comment for me, because this is a person who actually, as a young child, was taken to the camps with her parents because her father was a priest of our church, and grew up in exile. Returned to Lviv, has a family in Lviv, but is thankfully, God bless her, still alive. And in her first email to me after I was asking her how she was doing, her response was, "Ukraine has never been so united." So even though we're talking about a diverse, complex reality, we're also talking about a community, a culture that has somehow found itself at a crossroads, and at that crossroads has become, as she said, never so united. And in a certain sense, I'll say that the symbol for that unity has really become President Zelensky, who I think most Ukrainians would comment has outperformed expectations. And himself being Jewish isn't it representative of that unity? Rather than Orthodoxy, rather than Greco-Catholicism, rather than a Christian, he represents a faith which is also a very rich and important part of the cultural and religious fabric of Ukraine. But let me get to my topic and to my approach. What I would like to begin with is speaking about someone who, very briefly, who became an important figure in I'll call it the pre-Maidan period. So prior to 2014 and the Revolution of Dignity. And he was at that time the head of our church, the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church, Patriarch Lyubomir Huzar. Now, why do I mention him? I'm mentioning him because he was party to and one of the initiators of interesting group of intellectuals, a group of intellectuals called the 1st of December. And among them, we find again, that plurality, that diversity of community. So this was not a religious group of intellectuals. This was a group of intellectuals which represented the wide variety of the Ukrainian cultural spectrum. They played a very important role in terms of publicly stating and challenging the government to improve the way in which it addressed the needs of the populace, especially, of course, given the post-Soviet environment, the question of corruption. Patriarch Huzar, although representing our minority church, in most of the opinion polls at that time, in the period when he was the head from 2001 to 2011, he became one of the most popular and figures in Ukraine, and regularly in opinion polls appeared as one of the top 3 or 4 most trusted figures in the cultural environment of Ukraine. I point this out because what I'm arguing, or what I would like to argue, is that in the experience of the Greco-Catholic Church, we're seeing how a religious institution can actually express itself and move into society as an active and very positive element, without necessarily promoting itself as in terms of wanting to convert people, if you will. The Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church now, although as our previous panelists mentioned, originally centered itself in Western Ukraine, now is present throughout Ukraine. There are dioceses and exarchates throughout all of Ukraine, including exarchates now in Russia and Kazakhstan. So it's present in one form or another throughout the territory of Ukraine. It is still mainly, the participants are still mainly people who are either living in Western Ukraine or find their origins in Western Ukraine. So, for example, there are a few, but very few parishes where the liturgy will be celebrated in Russian or Old Slavonic. It is dominated by contemporary Ukrainian. But the influence of that our church and that church itself really kind of came to the fore, I think, during the Revolution of Dignity, the Maidan of 2014, where, again, not as the lead, not even as perhaps the most significant voice, but just one of the many participants who represent the broad spectrum of Christian groups and faiths. Because in the Maidan, we have really in many ways, we had the experience of Ukraine as an interfaith community. So often in the main stage of the Maidan, on that stage, you would have representatives of, yes, Orthodox churches, Catholic Church, yes, Protestant churches, but you'd also have the visible presence of senior rabbi and senior imam of Ukraine. So that atmosphere was very clearly one in which all religious faiths, so to speak, were represented and welcome. And it's that dynamic of the plurality, the diversity of the religious horizon that continued after the Maidan. And as Dr. Denisenko mentioned, the internal Orthodox dynamic has been problematic between those who are more Ukrainophile and those who are more Russophile, and the names of the churches have to some degree changed over the past 8 years. So in the development of this kind of broad ecumenical vision, the Russophile, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate, has not been fully participant. But what has happened, though, is the others, if I will, through, as Dr. Coleman mentioned, through the All Ukrainian Council on Religion, have found a common voice and a common comfort level, if you will. Interestingly, with this war, as I mentioned at the very outset, Ukraine has never been so united. And so what we're now seeing is, in fact, some representatives of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate actually coming out and speaking in condemnatory tone of the invasion, and that their voice is now joining into that larger community of voices. Just day before yesterday, a statement came out from Odessa of representatives of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, representative of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, the Greco-Catholic Church, the senior rabbi of Odessa, and the assistant imam of Odessa, in which they all spoke together about the fact that Odessa does not need to be liberated. Odessa is a city in which all religions and all cultures have been and are welcome. So we see that voice that perhaps hadn't been part of the larger broad is beginning. And it's not only in Odessa, there are other examples of that kind of beginning of a greater unity. But back, if I may, back to the Greco-Catholic picture. The influence of the Greco-Catholic Church has not simply been through its ecclesial presence, if you will. I would say that one of the most significant voices has come out of the university sector. And again, I'm speaking here specifically of the Ukrainian Catholic University in View, which is an independent university created very much on the North American model, or more specifically on the US model. And during the period of the Maidan, it was the Ukrainian Catholic University and its president at that time, who was at that time Father Boris Guziak, who is currently the Ukrainian Catholic Metropolitan of Philadelphia. That university played a very significant role in terms of supporting and encouraging students and in fact, lecturers and professors to participate in the Maidan. And one of those professors actually was killed on the Maidan. The Ukrainian Catholic University has established connections throughout Europe, academic connections. And so it's been a very helpful vehicle to bring the message of Ukraine as a different kind of state, a different culture, a different religious environment than Russia itself. So it's helped, I think, increase the familiarity of people in Western Europe and North America to recognize that, you know, the image and the presentation that kept coming out of and continues to come out of Russia in terms of this Ruski Mir is not exactly the picture and the understanding of contemporary Ukraine. I will add here too that one of the universities is very, very much collaborated with the Ukrainian Catholic University and has also similarly played a very progressive role is the Kievo-Mohyla Academy, which is the historical continuation of the Kievo-Mohyla Academy that Dr. Coleman mentioned earlier. The other kind of social role that the Greco-Catholic Church has played in this it began before Maidan, of course, but in the post-Maidan period, especially because of its humanitarian efforts in the occupied territories in Donbass, and especially now it's working very vigilantly and energetically, is Caritas. And Caritas is a Catholic organization, international organization, but within Ukraine, it is mainly staffed and functioning with and through the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church. Now, a number of Caritas offices are also supported strongly by the Roman Catholic Church, but again, the Roman Catholic Church is smaller in number and influence in Ukraine. Currently, there are 36 local offices at this time in Ukraine, Caritas offices, and they are centers of humanitarian aid for citizens. So any kind of what we call social supports, because let's not forget that the social safety nets in Ukraine are minimal. absolutely minimal, and in some ways one can simply say abhorrent. I'm thinking specifically here in terms of issues around persons with disabilities. Ukraine is struggling to get out of the old Soviet models. Some places have been more successful in doing that. In other places, it's been harder, and oftentimes, of course, budgets are one of the great constraints, unfortunately. But Caritas has done that historically. But with the situation in the Donbass, the occupied territories, supplying humanitarian aid to the residents there, supporting the fledgling chaplaincy programs that have started. And here I'll mention that the Canadian Armed Forces Chaplaincy Department has been very, very helpful in developing a professional chaplaincy service to the armed forces. So we have that model, but also now in the current situation, what we're dealing with is, and again, depending on the local office, they're helping house people who are displaced persons. They're helping feed people en route. They're helping transport people with the quote unquote green corridors when they have become available, or just transport into those people who are able to travel reasonably safely but don't have cars or vehicles for transportation. 2 offices have been formally closed. That is in Kharkiv and Volnovakha. Volnovakha being occupied, and Kharkiv because of the dangers. However, the personnel from both of those offices have simply moved west and are still functioning by coordinating humanitarian aid back to those centers as much as possible. And also the other thing that has happened because of the invasion is that very often churches are physically churches, the place of worship has actually become used as storage places, as places to house people, to support them in their struggle. So the life of the church is very much really in Ukraine right now focused on that priority, is to stand and be with the people in their daily troubles. And I think that's best visualized or best present by the leader of our church, Patriarch Shevchuk, who on a daily basis is issuing video messages to his faithful, and the messages tend to focus, as one would expect, around messages of support, the issue of defending our land, defending our people, as he would put it, and seeking peace. And that our church always, and the faithful always have to be focused on, we're not about a war, we're about wanting to restore peace in Ukraine. And the general atmosphere that I'm hearing from in my contacts in Ukraine is that his messages are being very well received by all, because he is definitely avoiding any overt attacks on Russia or on the Russian church. I suppose in a fundamental way, what I see is happening right now is we're being, all of us, whether we're in Ukraine or beyond Ukraine, we're being faced with 2 fundamental questions. And what is that? And those are, for someone like myself, as a pastor, as a priest, is what does it mean to be a priest in this situation? How does one really witness the presence of Christ in this situation? How does one witness to our faithful, and to be honest with you, to ourselves, that Christ's message is not only repeated in our words, but expressed in our actions? And of course, then, what does it mean to be church? And I don't pretend to have an answer, but I would suggest that one of the ways in which that question of what does it mean to be church is being answered is similar to what I feel that I saw with the Maidan, with the Revolution of Dignity, and that is that the church is bigger than we allow it to be. And what I mean is that by that is too many of our historic anxieties, if I can put it mildly, have not allowed us to recognize the church as it is. I want to get onto one last point, and that is because I'm speaking as a Greco-Catholic priest, I want to address the question of how the Pope has approached this whole situation. And I know that there's much concern expressed by some that the Pope has never actually come out and said, the Russians are doing this. And I think that anybody who's familiar with ongoing Roman Catholic diplomacy, and it's continued in a certain sense by Pope Francis, that's because there's always been a historical concern since the 1960s to have some form of dialogue, positive dialogue with the Moscow Patriarchate. But having said that, I think that I have to remark that it is astounding how active Pope Francis has been on the issue and making it very clear that he stands as a voice for peace and as a voice against the invasion. Two times now, one prior to the invasion and one subsequent to the invasion, he has asked for all Catholics around the world to pray for peace in the world. And one of those occasions was Ash Wednesday for Roman Catholics, a very symbolic and powerful day in and of itself. And then adding this prayer for peace, I think, was very important. And we know that Catholics around the world responded in immense numbers to that call. Second of all, since the war, I think diplomatically, he has made a number of very important strides, gestures, if you will. One being sending 2 very senior cardinals to Ukraine as a symbol of his support, physical presence of his support. Second of all, and I think this perhaps was the most astounding, 2 days ago, he had a video conference with Patriarch Kirill, in which I think if you read the text of his comments, you can only conclude that he was, my words, lecturing Kirill and reminding him about how, as church leaders, in his words, we should use the words of Christ, not the words of war. I think that message was very powerful and very clear. And I know many people around the world applaud it. So final comment. I think that the fact that the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church has been able to expand its voice, its social voice, inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine, and especially then Pope Francis's appeals, has made it very, has laid the foundation for the fact how clearly the majority of the voices that we're hearing in the world are voices calling for peace in Ukraine and condemning the Russian invasion. Thank you, John.
Thank you so much, Miroslav. So important that we put the focus on the Christian need, and focus needs to be on how do we create peace. I want to introduce our last panelist, who will analyze the Russian war of aggression in terms of the just war theory. Paul Gavrilik holds the Aquinas Chair in Theology and Philosophy at the Theology Department of the University of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota. He was born in Kiev, Ukraine. He studied physics at the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology in Russia, 1988 to 1993. He is one of the first scholars from the former Soviet Union to come to the United States to pursue graduate work in theology. In 2001, he received his doctorate in patristics from Religious Studies program at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. He has written numerous books, including The Suffering of the Impassible God, The Dialectics of Patristic Thought, Oxford 2004, and George Florovsky and the Russian Religious Renaissance, Oxford 2013. He's also the founding president of the International Orthodox Theological Association, an organization that includes scholars from 30 countries. Dr. Gavrilik, welcome.
Thank you very much, John. And well, dear listeners, I want to say, first of all, that the present war affects me personally. My own parents who are in their mid-70s and now refugees. They fled this war from their flat, their apartment in Kyiv, first to the suburb of the city, and then further west, and then crossed the border was Moldova, and then subsequently crossed 7 countries to reach Lithuania. It was providential that my brother has been stationed with his family for the last 5 years in Lithuania, and just yesterday, he brought to Lithuania our 98-year-old grandmother. Yes, a 98-year-old grandmother had to make what is actually her second flight from a war zone into safety in Lithuania. Thankfully, all of my relatives are doing relatively well, despite the fact, of course, that the war has scarred them permanently. And so what I want to talk about today is the fact that what's happening in Ukraine is a genocide against the Ukrainian people, against the Ukrainian nation. Many of you have heard the reports about the bombing of the drama theater in the southern city of Mariupol, where people were taking shelter, and the shelter itself was specifically marked on both sides in large letters was the word children in Russian, as to protect it from the bombing. That theater was bombed to pieces yesterday, and today we know that there were more than 1,000 people inside the theater. So those who could get help are still being evacuated from the area, but there's going to be an untold number of deaths as a result of that completely senseless murder. The second largest city of Ukraine, Kharkiv, is being completely destroyed. It is home to 24 universities with 200,000 students. If there are students in our audience today, you would especially appreciate that point. And this particular city now has over 500 casualties. The Russian losses in this war, by very conservative NATO estimates, are now well over 7,000 men and women. And those losses are significantly higher than all American losses over the 20-year period of our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is not, of course, in any way to justify American actions in Afghanistan and Iraq, but simply to give you a sense of the intensity of this war, which in 20 days took over 7,000 of Russian soldiers, including 3 generals, and the death of the 4th Russian general was reported today. Which is to say that in his war against Ukrainian civilians and in his war against Ukrainian children, and more than 100 have now died, Putin is also not sparing at all his own soldiers. There's not a single large Russian city in which there isn't a mother that's now mourning a son that died in this completely meaningless war. So with this said, you might be asking yourselves a question: does one actually even need to belabor the point that this is an unjust war? I think we certainly, all of us, feel it in our hearts. I think it requires a considerable amount of brainwashing to say otherwise, given the losses that have now been sustained and the death toll. And also, whenever you're counting the wounded, you have to multiply it by a factor of 3. But I still think it would be good to process with a sense of moral and rational judgment as to what makes this war especially unjust. And so there are 7 criteria that the Christian just war theory applies to any particular military engagement. And the first criterion is that the war has to be the last resort. Now, it's pretty obvious that in this situation, this war cannot be counted as the last resort, because fundamentally and primarily, this war had no justification whatsoever. Nobody, neither NATO, nor Ukraine, nor any other country was attacking Russia. NATO did not invade Russia in 2008. Russia invaded Georgia and appended 2 territories. NATO did not invade Russia in 1991. Russia invaded Moldova and has a frozen conflict there. NATO did not invade Russia in 2014. Russia illegally annexed Crimea and subsequently invaded eastern Ukraine. Again, NATO did not invade Russia in 2022, but it was Russia that invaded Ukraine from 3 sides. Now, the war has to be waged by a legitimate authority, and that is the second criterion of the just war. This seems to be the only criterion that is fulfilled, because legitimate authority is defined as a government and not, for example, a terrorist group. In other words, Putin's government at present is legitimate still, and to the extent to which it's still legitimate, although that is increasingly a big question, the war is waged by a legitimate authority. And an illegitimate authority would be something like ISIS or Taliban. But the tactics that Putin's regime is showing in Russia is no better, and in fact is worse than that of Taliban and than that of ISIS. Because after all, Taliban and ISIS are fighting by using terrorist means precisely because they're a fairly small group and they're not as well armed. And in the case of Russia, you have the second largest army in the world fighting a comparably significantly smaller army, and again, not sparing civilians. So yes, it's a war that's fought by a legitimate authority, but the authority whose very own credentials, political, moral, and otherwise, are being undermined as this war continues, and in fact, arguably have been undermined. Putin is a mass murderer, and certainly he is someone who deserves the punishment of The Hague, which has already started a process. Now, a cause of the war has to be just, and it's a redress of wrongs suffered. So in this case, Putin used trumped up charges that somehow Russian-speaking Ukrainians are not being treated fairly in Ukraine. Well, I have to tell you, as a Russian-speaking Ukrainian myself, that certainly Russian-speaking Ukrainians in Ukraine are treated much better than Russians themselves today are treated by their own government when they're denied their basic freedoms. Putin used exactly the same argument, that is to say, an argument that was morally similar to the one that Hitler used when he occupied Czechoslovakia in 1938. He used perceived grievances of the German-speaking population against the Czech-speaking population as a cause for the occupation of Czechoslovakia. Putin does the same, and he certainly has proven himself to be as callous and murderous as Hitler. Now, the war has to have a reasonable chance of success. In this particular case, on Putin's side, this is a completely unwinnable war. The Russian economy is now significantly compromised. There is a very little chance that Putin will in fact take Kyiv, which is his goal. His goal is to take the capital, and that would be incredibly difficult. If we do not offer sufficient protection to Ukrainians when it comes to the defense of its air, and of course we realize that this could be accomplished in different ways. If we don't offer that protection, Kyiv can be in fact reduced to rubble, but that doesn't mean that Kiev will be occupied. Essentially, not unlike Kharkiv or Mariupol, they will simply become wastelands. This would be a catastrophe of enormous proportions. But the important point that this senseless war simply cannot be won. It is now being waged to satisfy a hubris of one man, a lust to power of one man, a libido dominandi of one man, and the clique surrounding him, and the government machine and the media machine that supports his intentions. Now, the goal of any war has to be the reestablishment of peace. So that's the goal of a just war. In this particular case, there was a peaceful situation prior to that. Now, of course, there was a frozen conflict in eastern Ukraine that was created by Russians. But the fact of the matter is, it was a very low burning conflict. And in that regard, what is happening now, of course, has magnified the problem to the factor of 10. The sixth criterion of the just war is proportionality. And that is to say, violence used in war has to be proportional to the injury suffered. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Putin is waging a war on civilians and children. The Ukrainian army is not bombing Russian territories. The Ukrainian army is not bombing Belarus territories. The Ukrainian army is simply protecting its own people. And the methods that Putin is using, or the methods that he was using in Beslan, or the methods that he was using in Abkhazia, or the methods that he was using in Syria, and in the cruel war in Chechnya that took more than 100,000 lives. And so obviously he is using completely vastly disproportional methods when he is destroying hospitals, when he is destroying maternity wards, as he did in Mariupol, and when he is destroying schools and apartment buildings. Now, finally, there has to be in the war discrimination between combatants and civilians. Today, Russian soldiers are so demoralized and they are so afraid that in that state of fright and in the state of being completely not understanding what this war is being fought for, they are constantly shooting at Ukrainian civilians. They are killing Ukrainian civilians every day. They are also abusing local population. They're marauding the cities, and they're doing unconscionable things and unspeakable things also to Ukrainian women. And so, needless to say, this is a war in which you only have combatants on one side, because again, Ukrainians are not fighting on the Russian territory. And yet the Russian forces are not trained and are not, at this point, differentiating between the combatants and civilians. And so, together with everybody else on this panel, I ask myself a question: what is it that we can do? I think at the global and the government level, we should be pressing for the no-fly zone. Several NATO countries have already expressed, including Latvia and Lithuania, have already been very positive regarding this matter. And I think the United States is being gradually nudged in this direction. And yes, this might provoke Putin to some other actions, but the reality is that a bully could be stopped only by a decisive action. As far as the local level is concerned, I think it's really significant, and we've already been encouraged by especially Father Miroslav to support important charitable organizations. And at the very, very beginning of the war, I and a number of influential Ukrainian American leaders of business community and educators have created Rebuild Ukraine. You will see in the chat a reference to our first newsletter that explains our activities. Our principal focus is now on saving as many lives as we possibly can, because as I speak, tens of lives are being lost in a given minute. And so our main emphasis is on saving lives. And one of the ways in which this could be achieved is by sending medical devices that could be life-saving. And our particular focus is on the bandages that stop bleeding in battle for the wounded soldiers. And so we've bought close to 30,000 worth of so-called tourniquets, and we're buying them in the Baltic countries, and we have the capacity of delivering them to the front lines. And I really mean front lines. That is to say, I mean Mariupol, I mean Kharkiv, I mean Donetsk, and other places. And of course, so many other towns have now become front lines. And our second important emphasis is on the children of the war. And we want to think strategically about the time when this war will end. And there will be, and are already, so many children that are scarred by the war, whether they would need prosthetics, whether they would need medical and psychological treatment. And we specifically are positioned also to help children to come to the United States and to pursue study abroad in the United States. And we've teamed up with Ellen Academy in Texas to bring in high schoolers, Ukrainian high schoolers. We're hoping to start with 5 or 10 of them and then build that to about 50 a year. Of course, I would also encourage you to consider receiving Ukrainian refugees in your parishes, in your homes, and in a variety of other ways. There are more than 3 million of them, and there will be more in this unspeakable disaster. And if do everything to rebuild Ukraine. So we will also have a website set up very soon, and of course contribute also to a variety of charities of your choice. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Paul, both for the personal dimension, which is really at the heart of any war, the suffering, the unspeakable suffering in what you described as a completely meaningless war. I'd invite the panelists to unmute themselves and to join us as well, and put their cameras back on. There's a number of questions. I'm not sure that we can get to all of the questions. Some were answered, I think, in your own comments, however. But one of them had to do with both, is there, or a number of questions, I should say, covered the religious landscape. Is the needle going to be moved at all for, let's say, Patriarch Kirill, in terms of people, that is, priests and others within his own church opposing him? Or could there be movement, again, in terms of Pope Francis's intervention? So we had a number of questions sort of dealing with this, and I think looking for a glimmer of hope in that respect. Do you think any of this sort of religious, I don't know what we want to call it, a kind of a desire to see the end of war, this push to peace from other religious leaders, will that have any impact? Could that? And I'd open that up to any of the panelists. I see Miroslav, and then Paul.
I'll just jump in, and maybe people regard this as overly optimistic, but I certainly think that if it, not particularly Patriarch Kirill, but I think that what's happening in Ukraine with members of the Moscow Patriarchate is certainly moving the needle. I think the statements coming out from a number of bishops, certainly quite a number of priests, have been very much. In fact, one priest said we need to look at some kind of new, he said, new church formation. So the voices are being raised louder than they have been raised in the past and more publicly. So that's very much hopeful. And honestly, from my perspective, if the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate moves more strongly in the direction of real autonomy or autocephaly that will force changes from Kirill's in some form or another.
Thank you, Paul, and then Nick.
So I think Patriarch Kirill is done politically, morally, and spiritually, meaning that his whole reign will be permanently colored and besmirched by the fact that he sees this as a metaphysical war, as the war of the forces of light against the forces of darkness. On the Forgiveness Sunday, he told his listeners at the Christ the Savior Cathedral that Ukrainians have a lot to ask forgiveness for Russians. That was the implied message of his statements. And he has continued saying that this war is waged because there are gay parades in Ukraine. Now, he has a very small number of useful idiots in the United States and Canada who seem to be interested in supporting that particular position. Certainly a few priests of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, including an archbishop in Canada, have publicly voiced support for the Russian war. And certainly all of them are already of interest to our intelligence service. So it is helpful that they speak vocally because it's much easier then to deal with them. And so this is not an academic matter any longer. This is a much more serious matter of state security. For all practical purposes, Patriarch Kirill's voice was the only voice that matters in this conversation. We can all have very polite and interesting negotiations. We can also make appearances that somehow diplomacy will work. Presently, no. Presently, what's going to work are anti-missile systems and stingers, and America is sending them, and that's important. But beyond that, Patriarch Kirill is done, and I am the president of the largest and the most influential theological society in the Orthodox world that counts more than 1,000 scholars, including people on this panel, and I will make everything possible, everything in my power, that effectively leaders like him will think twice before they support this war ideologically and then subsequently morally and otherwise.
Thanks, Paul. Nick, would you like to join in?
Yes, thank you. I won't repeat what others have said. I could affirm it, but I want to go back to 2013 and 14 and the Euromaidan revolution of dignity. The reason that this is important is that when we look at the Maidan, there was essentially a dream of a new Ukraine that did not depend on some kind of nostalgic past. Not Russian imperialism, not the fledgling Ukrainian governments of the late 1900s and early 1920s, but of a brand new Ukraine. And there was a lot of criticism at the time of the churches for kind of lagging behind. And there was a sense that when violence and bloodshed took place with the Heavenly Hundred, with the annexation of Crimea, with Donbass, keeping in mind that this is really the continuation of an 8-year war, right? It fully confirms what Paul was saying about a bully. What other escalations are possible when this is already an escalation of an existing war? So I think a number of church leaders essentially established that there was a point of no return. When the autocephaly was given by the Patriarchate of Constantinople to the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine, that was a sign of a shift in the Orthodox world, of not simply abiding by the existing status quo. And what I'm really looking for here is to see if in this terrible moment where we need exactly the things that Paul was saying, along with the humanitarian aid, if some good can come of it in that we can grasp a moment of unity and find that prophetic voice. there was a lot made of Metropolitan Onufri's comments, and they weren't particularly remarkable. They weren't as strong as comments from other church leaders, but they were remarkable because no one in his position had ever said anything like that before. And there seems to be an indication that even the church under Moscow has now reached that point of no return. And I think that's the big question that I'm waiting to see what's going to happen with this. The Ukrainian people are demonstrating incredible unity. And as there's sort of a refrain that goes around that Putin has united Ukrainians like no one before ever has. And in a certain sense, Putin has also united NATO in a sense, in the US in a way that no one ever has before. So the question is, will the church follow that lead? And that's really the test that I think that we're going to see now. And I guess I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, I think this is important. Heather had talked about unity and pluralism as well earlier. Heather, do you want to jump in, and then we'll go to Miroslav?
Well, I just wanted to, I also wanted to mention the role of Metropolitan Onufri, who is the leader of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, because but from the Russian side, I'm thinking of, Paul talked about the Kirill being done, and certainly there's a lot of tension out in the churches affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate outside of Russia, for sure. But I think that statement by Onufri actually was very important. I just looking at Russian colleagues and friends of mine who responded to that statement at the very beginning of the war, that this was the invasion of Ukrainian sovereign territory, stating that Ukraine was a sovereign state mattered, and that was a voice that could be heard in Russia, whereas other voices couldn't. Now that's been twisted. The Patriarch now is telling, in last week's sermon, telling the faithful that that the bishops of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church who have told their priests they don't need to commemorate him are being forced to do this by Ukrainian, the Nazi nationalists, etc. So that's being twisted. But I think that statement did allow for questioning on the Russian side. I had one friend who was very, very distressed by the sermon in his local church the first day after in the first Sunday after the war began, when he said there was no reference to what Onufri said, so that there was an awareness that was a voice that was there. So although there's very few, there are a small number of Orthodox priests who co-signed quite a letter that was led by evangelicals, Baptists and Pentecostals, who were opposing the war and talking about sovereign Ukraine. There were a number of Orthodox priests who added their name to that list, but not very many. But I think there is still an opening for some. I think that we shouldn't see the church as completely monolithic. I think it's very important to not see the church in Russia as monolithic.
Thank you. We are coming to the end of our time. Miroslav, did you want to have a comment?
Well, I think just something about Patriarch Kirill that I wonder about, and that's that we often focus on him in terms of what's happening in the church, but I think another factor that's affecting this is he is providing something very important to Putin. He is providing an ideological structure for what Putin is doing, and it's something that Putin doesn't have. In and of himself, he needs Kirill, he needs the Russian Orthodox Church. And even though, I love Paul's comment, he's done, but, he's only done, I think, if Putin is done. Because there's a very strong symbiotic relationship there, which has nothing to do with church. you know, it really has nothing to do with church.
Putin's in the driver's seat, if I could just.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. These are all really helpful comments. I know we could talk for much longer. I'm really thankful for our panelists for coming here. I do have some glimmer of hope from what you have all said, that there is this unity and pluralism in Ukraine that at this point doesn't seem to be destroyed, but is growing stronger. And that this is, and I think it was mentioned by both Heather and Nick that, and maybe Miroslav, that this is beyond the bounds of just Christianity as well, but also the Jewish and Muslim populations there. I know it's hard, you know, a panel like this doesn't matter in the big picture of war, which was outlined so powerfully by Paul, but I do think bearing witness matters. I do think bearing witness also always matters. It's a little bit, it's a small act. And I think our panelists have offered us a lot to think about tonight. And it's not the only thing we can do. And so we put some things in the chat in terms of offering humanitarian support, whatever kind of support that ones can offer, and whatever ways are now possible. But I thank all our panelists for what they've offered us tonight. I thank you so much for coming here at really what is the last minute. And I would ask all of the people who have been able to join us to think about how you might act in this case, whether it's through prayer, money, in encouraging your institutions and governments to act, and gathering to speak the truth is never a wasted moment. And so I offer peace to all of you as you go forth and as you continue to act. And I want to thank our panelists, and I know that there will be virtual applause for all of you from those who have joined us. But thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it. Paul.